Hello, everyone. This is Alex Patel, and this is going to mark my fifth political podcast. So, there's going to be a lot of topics that we cover. I'm going back to the standard three-topic format. So, I'm going to give you the topics, and then I'm going to give a brief background on what kind of happened with the shutdown situation, and then we'll move on from there. So, today, the three topics I want to cover are California as a model for solving the Washington problem, getting rid of gridlock, and actually passing policies. So that's going to be one. Two is going to be agenda setting, and that's how we should decide which things we're going to bring to the table to discuss as a nation. And then the third topic I'm going to talk about is military policy from the United States perspective. But before I go to those, I just want to talk about the shutdown. So luckily the crisis was averted, but unfortunately chances are we're going to have the similar crisis in January or February when the talks come around. And it's glad that finally we were able to get a clean, budget and the debt ceiling increase. But unfortunately, I feel like the big problems are still not being tackled. And as long as we have a Congress that's corrupt, that only cares about the money, the revolving door behind the lobbying and the special interests, we're never going to go anywhere. And that's why, and that brings me really to my first topic, and that's the California model. So California put in a lot of recent um, policies in place, mostly through propositions in which the citizens voted for. And it's been highlighted. The New York Times has talked about this. Scholars have talked about political science scholars have talked about this, and California has some really good models. So one of the models that California has is they have an independent commission that draws up not only state legislative lines but also congressional lines. So this helps avoid the problem of gerrymandering. The problem is politicians many times do not face any electoral consequences for their actions, in large part because of safe districting thanks to gerrymandering. In most states, politicians and state legislators control the district lines, which leads to heavy skews either way. In Chicago, in Illinois, this has helped the Democrats a lot, and in a lot of the Deep South, this has helped Republicans. And that's pretty obvious. But California is an independent commission, and of all the states, California is one of the most proportional states. That is the amount of votes for Democrats and Republicans lining up to Democrats and Republicans in the state assembly as well as Congress. Whereas you have other states that are very skewed, where the Democrats, might win 60-40 but only get a minority of seats. In fact, this happened overall with the 2012 elections, that Democrats actually got a larger share of the vote than Republicans, and yet Republicans got more seats. So having an independent commission seems like a very moderate, straightforward way to go. There aren't really much arguments against it. I mean, obviously there's some level of bias, but putting it in an independent commission is obviously better than having it just in political lines, especially since, the vested interest in politicians drawing safe districts. Independent commissions would do a lot of good. So along on that topic, California did some other things. So California, for the state legislator, so for state senators and state assemblymen, there are term limits, and these term limits are pretty flexible. It's a 12-year term limit essentially. You can change between the state senate and the state assembly because it's a two-chamber state legislator. So you can change between those. You have a max of 12 years, which is good because it's enough time so you don't have to worry about being a freshman and getting used to everything. I mean, you do have 12 years, but at the same time, it does put term limits, so there is a room for change, and that's actually cited as one of the main benefits of the California system, and it's helping avoid a lot of gridlock. And the last thing California did, which, at first I was opposed to, but then I realized could actually be a very good thing, is it has what's called a blanket primary. That is that everyone primaries at the same time. So rather than having a Republican primary and a Democratic primary, everyone's on the same primary, and the two people with the highest votes go on to the general election. So in theory, you could have two Democrats or two Republicans. It also makes it better for independents and third-party people to run. And at first I thought this idea was bad because everyone's running in the same primary and there could be, people's votes could be diluted, but then I realized this is actually a pretty good system, at least based on the results, and then even in theory, that it allows people to choose who they want, and it leads to more moderation. And what we see is that the state assembly, even though it's heavily Democratic, at least the policies they've been passing have been heavily centrist. You see a lot of Democrats passing a lot of pro-business legislation. You see a lot of Republicans in the state assembly and state senate going for immigration reform and things like that. So you see a lot of center policies. A lot of politicians are now coming and becoming moderate, and that's great. That's what we need our Washington D.C. to become at the federal level, rather than having huge partisanship on both sides. So I think the California model is a good step in the right direction. To be fair, a lot of California's policies were implemented recently, some as early as 2012. So, we have to adjust for time and see what are the long-term effects. But nonetheless, I think it is very promising. And given that California is my home state, I definitely have a bias towards there. But that is definitely a shout out to California. And as someone who wants to ideally run for office, going back to California, I want to take advantage of that system and kind of show it as a model for something that we can actually get things done. And that sort of ties into my second topic, and that's agenda setting. And that's how do we decide what topics are we going to cover? Should we cover immigration reform? Should we cover gun control? I'm talking about this from the congressional level. What should the nation be discussing? What should congressmen be passing? So the approach that I see is most logical is start with least controversial to most controversial. This is similar to what Clinton did in his early years before the 1994 elections. And that's that you start off with the things that have general support from the public, that seem pretty easy to pass, the usually smaller issues. So rather than starting off with the big issues like immigration or the budgeting process, put those on the back burner and start off with least controversial. And that's how you actually get things done and build momentum. So it would be things like just having universal background checks, or getting rid of the cap on Social Security, or maybe raising the minimum wage. Granted, some of these are controversial and big issues, but they're definitely a lot less controversial than things like raising taxes and cutting and spending cuts and immigration reform. So you have to start least controversial to most controversial, move along the way. Like having a federal law allowing for same-day registration is a pretty straightforward thing. And that would be a good way of encouraging more voter participation. Most people would agree to that. Something like eliminating the penny, just the small things, so that you actually are getting things done slowly but surely. Because there's a lot of things in DC that seem simple but aren't passed, like getting rid of the cap on Social Security. I don't know if I've talked about that yet. If not, I'll just briefly say that on Social Security, it's actually a regressive tax because you're capped at around $100,000, which means even if you make $1 million, you only have to pay the Social Security tax on the first 100,000. So proportionally, someone making 200,000 is paying a larger percentage of their income than someone making $1 million, because they're both taxed at the same amount. I think the rate is around 4 or 6% and taxed at a max of 100,000 or so. So that's good. That amount stays the same after your income goes over that cap limit. So proportionally, someone again making $1 million is actually paying less of their income towards Social Security than someone who's making 200,000, and that makes it a regressive tax. I'm not saying increase the tax, just get rid of that cap so everyone's taxed equally. Simple solution right there. All I want is a bill with that, nothing more, nothing less. Boom, solve the Social Security problem. You see, there's plenty of simple solutions in Washington that no one talks about. And you start off with these simple, small things and go on from there. Minimum wage. Rather than having a debate about increasing it a lot or a little, maybe increase it by 50 cents, but then tie it to CPI so it adjusts for inflation. That's a pretty fair and reasonable argument. That minimum wage was higher in the past, adjusted for inflation, than it is today. Tie it to the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, which measures inflation. And by the way, Social Security benefits are tied to CPI. So do the same thing with minimum wage, make it a small increase, maybe to like around $8 at the federal level, tie it to CPI so that it's adjusted for inflation automatically, and so at least it increases by a small amount. Now, ideally, I'd like to see a living wage at least of $11, $13, but pick your battles, and I think that would be a smart way to go. Lower the drinking age to 18. A very simple solution. Right now, states can actually technically lower their drinking age. The problem is federal highway funding is tied to that, and there's a penalty if your drinking age is under 21. So simply strict the 21 in the law, put the term 18, and problem solved. Now you lower your drinking age to 18. Theoretically, states could have higher drinking rates, but we definitely see some states decrease their rate of to consume and to consume alcohol. You get a lot more revenue. You reduce underage drinking. You can get more funding for alcoholism and treatment and addiction, things like that. So it's just a pretty simple solution. Although legalizing marijuana would be a good step in the right direction, that's actually probably a more controversial issue. But that's something that does need to be addressed. So start least controversial to more controversial. But that being said, you do got to cover the spending cuts and tax increases, and that's a big topic. And I'd like to go and give out my tax plan and solutions another day because I know that's going to take a while to get through. So I'll probably do one podcast in the future, eventually tackling just that issue alone. And if there's something you want me to cover, comment, leave me a message, do something so that I know what you want to cover. If you live in the DC area and you would like to come on the podcast, please let me know. I'm looking to have some guests in the next few weeks. I have some friends that have been showing interest so we can get more perspective and it's not just my annoying voice talking the whole time. All right, so the third issue we're going to cover is military policy. So U.S. military policy I'm highly critical of. I feel like both parties essentially just war, and it's the military-industrial complex. Now I'm not saying war is always wrong, but there has to be a high threshold for going to war. After all, war shouldn't be something we just throw out and we come to accept. It should be something we want to do in the worst case scenario. And we should only do it really when an actual, legal state attacks us and we have room to respond. And I would say the last time we really had jurisdiction of that sort and we really had a reason to go to war was the Second World War, which made sense. But from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan, we've simply just making mistakes. We've failed miserably, in large part because they're threats that didn't directly affect us. They didn't attack us. The Vietnamese, the Koreans. It was a dangerous situation, but it's not as though they were going against the United States, and it just led to all these political power plays that had no basis in responding to self-defense. Now, you could argue that Afghanistan was self-defense, but the problem was the Afghan government didn't sanction this attack. It was a select group of terrorists. In that case, you want to do letters of marque and reprisal, which basically say we're going to go after these guys, rather than saying, yeah, let's go to a war with the whole country, even though the country had nothing to do with it but a select few people. I mean, imagine if an American acted on his own and committed some heinous act in Germany, and then Germany went to war with the U.S. Perhaps that's not the best example because of World War I and World War II. So let's say an American went to, France and committed some terrorist act. We wouldn't feel it reasonable for the French to attack us because it wasn't the U.S. government, it was just some lone American. Yet somehow, if people, and most of the people on 9/11, by the way, were Saudi Arabian, if you didn't know that. I believe around 15 out of 19 of the people on 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. Anyway, with that being said, going back to the U.S.-French example, we wouldn't feel it justified for France to go to war with the U.S. So why do we feel it justified to go to war with Afghanistan? Also, Iraq, a big joke, no WMDs, had nothing to do with 9/11. Saddam Hussein, a bad guy, but we actually had CIA documents revealing we helped gas the Kurds in the first Gulf War, or not the first Gulf War, but in the Iran-Iraq War. So it just seems like you have the military-industrial complex all over the place, not serving to help people or U.S. citizens, but rather serving private interests, whether it be military contractors or political power players, etc. Iran-Contra affair. The list just goes on and on. So I would like to see a more restrained military policy. Now, people get this misconception that restraint equals, isolation and that we won't be powerful. But I think restraint actually shows more courage. It shows that you're not just going to go to war over every little thing and that, you only go to war or only use military force when it's absolutely necessary. I think we can pull back our forces from Germany and Korea and Japan. Let those countries develop their own militaries, South Korea, Japan, and Germany. They're industrialized countries, all of them. They're all pretty good economically. They all have their room to grow. And Germany and Japan and South Korea are not likely to turn against the United States anytime soon, nor become antagonists of the world. So let's remove our soldiers and troops there, save us money, allow them to build up their own military, and let other people contribute. I mean, after all, Americans and especially conservatives don't like the free rider problem when people take services and yet don't contribute. I mean, that's their argument against welfare, which is a flawed argument, but that's the argument. Yet, when it comes to when I say it's a flawed argument, I mean in terms of welfare because they're assuming that these people don't do anything. But in terms of the argument itself, if you apply it to the military policy of the United States, you'll see that it makes sense for these industrialized countries to play a larger role rather than the U.S. putting up all the funding. I mean, our military funding is higher than the next 20 countries combined, and most of those countries are our allies. So I don't really see a need to increase military spending, and a decrease could be highly substantial. And usually decreases of military spending don't have to come at the expense of our veterans or their benefits. Usually you could simply make those cuts by not buying new equipment, getting rid of equipment you don't use, because a lot of this equipment is just stockpiling, but it doesn't actually ever you know it doesn't actually ever be used, so it's just a waste of money anyway. So I think that's how you frame the military issue, and we should definitely have a lot more restraint. I think we should definitely treat prisoners with respect. I mean, the prisoners might be very horrible and disgusting people, but that's why you if you truly believe you're better than them, if you truly believe what makes you right and them wrong is a sense of moral superiority, then don't bow down to their level and use their tactics. Don't torture them like they would torture maybe U.S. captives. Be better than them. Stand above. So I would definitely like to see us, stop the torture, which for a large part we have done, but there's still arguably some torture in Guantanamo. I like to see the people in Guantanamo actually get a trial rather than standing there, especially if they're U.S. citizens. And it makes no sense, have a trial, have some sort of due process system. It doesn't make sense to just keep them there forever, and that's a violation of human rights. I mean, they might be horrible people, but they deserve to be judged and then prosecuted accordingly rather than held in a state of limbo, which could go on indefinitely. I mean, what if we just say the war on terror is going to happen forever? I'd also like to see the United States, stop all this like political power plays. Let the world play out, because oftentimes we end up messing things up, like when we supported the Mujahideen and they ended up becoming the Taliban. So we just got to be wary of choosing our battles and who we decide to ally with. And not every solution requires a military, not every problem requires a military solution. As we saw in Syria, a diplomatic solution helped a lot with the chemical weapons problem. And we should be focused on using diplomacy more and more rather than just believing every problem can be solved with the barrel of a gun. You know, there's this false notion that somehow our peace comes through strength, but I believe that's oxymoron or hypocrisy, because if your peace is through strength, then it won't last, because then it's not about who is right but who is left. That famous quote, war doesn't determine who is right, it determines who is left, meaning it doesn't determine who's morally right or justified, but simply who wins the battle. And so we got to be very careful of that, and realize that the military industrial complex is real. A lot of times, a lot of private contractors will want to go to war because there's a lot of money to be had, a lot of perks to be had, and we got to stop that, because war should only be used in the worst case scenario. It's not to say there should never be that we can never go to war, but I definitely don't feel like we've had a reason to go to war really since World War II. If someone attacks us, go after those people if they're not a country. At least in World War II, it was the state of Japan, the Japanese military, that attacked us at Pearl Harbor. It was the German state and the German military committing those atrocities. It wasn't like a German terrorist acting by himself or a group of German terrorists. Going and just relating that to Afghanistan, if you do have terrorists attacking you and they're not directly sanctioned by the state, go after those people through letters of marque and reprisal. That is, go after them specifically, but don't lead to a giant war. Don't lead to this big push for war, which just leads to a giant disaster. And as we saw, it cost us trillions of dollars. We have little to show for it. Afghan and Iraq are still not that much better and arguably worse. Oh, and one other thing, a lot of civilian casualties as well, and that only helps our enemies because they see us killing bad or innocent people, and it makes it hard for them to justify being on our side. I mean, I know the other guys, the Taliban and other extremists, kill innocent people left and right, sometimes intentionally. But let's not also ignore our mistakes too. Two wrongs doesn't make a right. And with drone policies, I would like to see us do a lot of less sanctioned drone strikes. If it's in a combat zone, that's understandable. But if they're U.S. citizens, and if we have even the remote chance that there could be civilians affected, then let's call off those drone strikes. And let's only do it in the battlefield and not just wherever we want. Let's not make the world of our own little playground in which we can do whatever we want, because it's leading to very disastrous consequences. It's leading to a lot of people becoming more extreme, a lot of anti-U.S. sentiment. And if we care about our security, if we care about the quality of life of American citizens and the quality of life of people around the world and innocent people around the world, then we won't want to just kill people left and right indiscriminately, leading to a lot of civilian deaths. There's a lot of reports out that are civilian. The UN just recently had a report published in the last 24 hours that U.S. or civilian deaths caused by the United States in this whole drone war have been a lot higher than the U.S. has been reporting, and it's leading to very disastrous consequences. So it is a real thing. It's not just a theoretical. And if we really believe we're morally superior, if we really believe we're better than them, because we don't attack innocent people. I mean, after all, isn't that the whole argument against 9/11? They caused a terrorist attack which killed innocent people. Well, it doesn't really help our case if we kill innocent people. And it's one thing if you're in a firefight and some gunshots hit some innocent civilians. That's definitely a bad case scenario, but at least it makes more sense than just going on a drone strike in which you have no fear of losing any human life, and you could possibly kill civilians, and you do it anyway just to maybe take out one guy. And it's sad that we're in a state that believes that that's right or justified, and I don't think that's right. Bad guys are bad guys, but innocent people are innocent people as well. So that's just things I hope you take to heat. So that basically concludes my podcast. Again, I'm making these a lot shorter so they're a lot easier to navigate to and you don't get bored as much. Again, if you have any topics you want me to cover, if you'd like to come on the show, whatever it is, if you're interested at all, just let me know, comment me, message me. I really appreciate your support. If you have any tips or suggestions for how to make it better, how to make the podcast more engaging or better, please let me know. Anything at all your advice is definitely taken into account. So I hope you enjoy that. This is one of many podcasts, hopefully, in the future. Hopefully you learn something from it. And again, if you want to debate me, discuss me, agree with me, just let me know. Have a good day. And I guess that concludes this podcast.